The cold winter night wrapped around Officer James Wilson's patrol car like a thick blanket. The dashboard clock showed 11:45 p.m. as he sipped his lukewarm coffee, his 10th hour into what had been a quiet shift. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a black Mercedes S-Class rolling down Oak Street, its windows tinted just a shade too dark for his liking. Well, what do we have here?" Wilson muttered to himself, placing his coffee in the holder. The car was moving exactly at the speed limit, making perfect stops at every sign. Too perfect, he thought. In his 15 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his gut, and something about this car didn't sit right with him. Inside the Mercedes, Judge Marcus Thompson was mentally reviewing his notes for tomorrow's federal case. The soft classical music playing through his car's premium speakers helped him think, a habit he'd developed during his 25 years on the bench. His bow tie hung loose around his neck after the long day, his judge's robe carefully hung in the back seat. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Thompson's hands immediately went to the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained since his father first taught him how to handle police stops when he was 16. "Stay calm, be polite, move slowly," his father's voice echoed in his memory. Wilson called in the plate number as he stepped out of his patrol car. The registration came back clean, registered to Marcus Thompson, resident of the wealthy Green Hills neighborhood. This only made Wilson more suspicious. He approached the driver's side window with his right hand resting near his holstered weapon. "Turn off the engine and lower all windows," Wilson barked, his flashlight beam cutting through the driver's side window. Thompson complied immediately, the soft whir of electric windows breaking the night's silence. "Good evening, officer," Thompson said calmly, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Wilson's flashlight beam moved deliberately around the car's interior before settling on Thompson's face. "Your windows appear to be tinted beyond legal limits, sir." It wasn't true the windows were exactly at the legal limit, as Thompson had specifically requested when purchasing the car. "I can assure you they're within regulation, officer. I have the certification in my glove compartment." "Would you like me to retrieve it? What's your hurry to get to the glove compartment?" Wilson's voice carried an edge. "Step out of the vehicle." Thompson took a deep breath. "Officer, I want to comply with all your instructions, but I think it's important you know that I'm Federal Judge Marcus Thompson. My credentials are also in the glove compartment." Wilson's face hardened. "Oh, so you're a federal judge now?" "Step out of the car slowly, hands where I can see them." Thompson complied, his movements deliberate and calm. His tall frame unfolded from the car, his tailored suit catching the streetlight. Even with his tie undone, he carried himself with unmistakable dignity. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle," Wilson ordered, calling for backup on his radio. "We've got someone here claiming to be a federal judge." As Thompson stood there, hands pressed against his own car, he thought about all the similar stops he'd experienced before becoming a judge. He thought about his son in law school, his daughter in medical school. He thought about how, despite all his achievements, despite his position, despite the American flag pin on his lapel, he was still just another suspicious black man in a nice car to some. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the street in a carnival of red and blue. From one stepped Officer Robert Miller, a 20-year veteran who regularly provided courthouse security. His eyes widened in recognition. "Judge Thompson?" Miller's voice carried genuine surprise and growing alarm. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" Wilson's flashlight beam wavered slightly. For the first time that night, a seed of doubt crept into his mind. But Judge Thompson just stood there, still calm, still dignified, and thought about how this moment could become something more than just another statistic, another story, another reason for anger. Because in his years on the bench, he'd learned something important. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of realization. And this, he decided, would be one of those moments. Officer Miller's recognition of Judge Thompson created a ripple effect through the scene. The red and blue lights continued to flash, casting strange shadows across everyone's faces. Wilson's hand remained near his weapon, but uncertainty had crept into his stance. "Your Honor, I had no idea." Miller started, moving forward, but Wilson cut him off. "Hold on. Anyone can claim to be a judge. We need to verify this." Wilson's voice carried a challenge, but there was a slight tremor in it now. "For all we know, this could be an impersonation attempt." Thompson stayed perfectly still, hands still on his Mercedes. "Officer Miller, would you mind reaching into my glove compartment? My judicial credentials and bar card are in a leather folder." Miller looked at Wilson, who gave a sharp nod. As Miller retrieved the documents, more patrol cars arrived. The quiet suburban street was now lit up like a Christmas display, attracting curious faces to nearby windows. Wilson examined the credentials with exaggerated care, shining his flashlight over every detail. The federal seal gleamed back at him. The photo matched. The security features were all present. His throat felt dry. These could be fake, Wilson insisted, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Judge Thompson finally turned around, his movements still careful and measured. "Officer Wilson, that is your name, correct? I've spent 30 years in the legal system. First as a public defender, then as a prosecutor, and now as a federal judge. In all that time, I've learned that moments like these define us not by how they start, but by how we choose to handle them." A small crowd had gathered at the edges of the police lights. Some had their phones out, recording. Wilson felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold night air. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," Wilson said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Your job," Thompson said quietly, "is to protect and serve. Tell me, what made you suspect my vehicle tonight?" The question hung in the air. Wilson opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was there, uncomfortable and undeniable. Lieutenant David Parker arrived next, nearly jumping out of his car when he recognized Thompson. "Your Honor! What in the world?" He looked at Wilson, then at the gathering crowd, understanding dawning on his face. "Lieutenant," Thompson acknowledged with a slight nod. "Perhaps we could move this discussion somewhere more private? I believe Officer Wilson and I have some important matters to discuss." Parker began barking orders, dispersing the other officers. But Wilson stood rooted to the spot, his face a mix of emotions: fear, shame, and something else. "Recognition, perhaps." "Officer Wilson," Thompson said, his voice carrying the same authority it held in his courtroom, "you have a choice to make right now. This moment can either be a dead end or a turning point. Which would you prefer?" Wilson looked at the judge, really looked at him for the first time that night. He saw not just a black man in an expensive car, but someone who'd faced this same situation countless times and chosen to turn each incident into an opportunity for change. I would like to apologize, Your Honor," Wilson managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "An apology is a good start," Thompson replied. "But I'm more interested in understanding. And perhaps helping you understand too." He turned to Lieutenant Parker. "I'd like to meet with Officer Wilson and Chief Roberts tomorrow morning. Would 9 a.m. be convenient?" Parker nodded quickly, relief visible on his face at Thompson's measured response. As the crowd began to disperse and officers returned to their patrol cars, Thompson finally picked up his credentials from Wilson's still outstretched hand. Their eyes met, and Wilson saw something unexpected in the judge's gaze: not anger or triumph, but a determined hope. "Tomorrow, Officer Wilson," Thompson said, straightening his tie. 9 a.m. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need the most. As Thompson drove away, Wilson stood in the street long after the Mercedes's taillights had disappeared. The night felt different now, heavier with the weight of what had happened and what was still to come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had already changed something fundamental in Wilson's world. The truth, he realized, could be just as blinding as his patrol car's spotlight. The police station's conference room felt smaller than usual to Officer Wilson as he sat waiting the next morning. His uniform felt tight around his neck, and he'd already loosened his collar twice. The wall clock showed 8:55 a.m. Chief Roberts paced near the window, his heavy footsteps breaking the tense silence. The morning news played quietly on a small TV in the corner, showing shaky cell phone footage from last night's incident. The story had already gone viral. "This could end your career," Roberts said, not for the first time that morning. "Do you understand that? Judge Thompson could have us all up on federal charges." Wilson stared at his hands. The same hands that had rested on his weapon during last night's stop. "I know, Chief." The door opened at exactly 9, and Judge Thompson walked in. He wore a different suit than last night, dark blue with a matching tie, his appearance impeccable. But it was his presence more than his clothes that filled the room. Behind him came Lieutenant Parker, carrying a thick folder. "Good morning, gentlemen," Thompson said, taking a seat across from Wilson. He placed a newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Federal Judge Detained in Late-Night Traffic Stop Questions of Racial Profiling Surface." Wilson's stomach turned. But Thompson didn't seem interested in the newspaper. Instead, he opened a leather portfolio he'd brought with him. "Officer Wilson," Thompson began, his voice measured. "Do you know how many times I've been pulled over in the last 30 years? Wilson shook his head. 127 times. Thompson's words landed like stones in still water. "I've kept record of every stop. Date, time, location, reason given. Would you like to know how many of those stops resulted in a ticket?" The room was silent except for the quiet drone of the TV. 3, Thompson continued. 3 actual violations and 127 stops. The rest were like last night: window tint, suspicious vehicle, failure to signal when I did signal, matching a description when I clearly didn't. Chief Roberts shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, we want to extend our deepest apologies." Thompson held up a hand. "Chief Roberts, I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because last night, I saw something in Officer Wilson's eyes when he realized his mistake. Something I've been waiting to see for 30 years. Wilson looked up, meeting Thompson's gaze. "You felt it, didn't you?" Thompson asked. "That moment when your world shifted a little. When you saw me as a person first, and everything else second." Wilson nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. I've never felt more ashamed." "Shame isn't productive," Thompson replied. "But understanding is." "Lieutenant Parker, the folder, please." Parker placed the folder on the table. Thompson opened it, revealing statistics, reports, and photographs. "This is 30 years of similar incidents in this city. Not just happening to me, but to doctors, lawyers, business owners, students. People whose only crime was driving while black." Thompson's voice remained calm, but carried weight. "I could file complaints. I could call for your badge. I could make this a national story." Wilson felt his career crumbling before his eyes. But Thompson wasn't finished. "Instead, I'm going to offer you something different. A chance to be part of the solution." The TV news had switched to showing Wilson's record: 8 years on the force, multiple complaints about aggressive stops, but also commendations for community service. "Your record shows someone who cares about their community," Thompson observed. "Someone who wanted to make a difference." "Where did that get lost, Officer Wilson?" Wilson felt tears threatening to form. I don't know, Your Honor. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats instead of people." Thompson nodded. "That's what I wanted to hear. Honesty. Recognition." He pulled out another document. "This is a proposal for a new training program. I want you to help me build it. Turn this moment into something that matters." The clock ticked loudly as Wilson stared at the document. In it, he saw not just a chance at redemption, but an opportunity to become the officer he'd originally dreamed of being. "Yes," Wilson said finally, his voice stronger. "I want to help." Thompson smiled for the first time since walking in. "Good. Because this is just the beginning." Chief Roberts and Lieutenant Parker exchanged looks of surprise. Outside the conference room, the station buzzed with activity, unaware that inside, a small but significant change was taking root. The revelation wasn't just Wilson's. It belonged to everyone in that room. The news vans had been camped outside the police station for 3 days straight. Reporters crowded the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of either Judge Thompson or Officer Wilson. The story had exploded across national media, with talking heads debating every angle of the incident. Inside his office, Chief Roberts watched the coverage with a frown. The mayor had called 6 times already, demanding updates. Civil rights groups were planning protests. Police unions were calling for support. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But in a small conference room down the hall, something unexpected was happening. Wilson sat across from Judge Thompson, both men surrounded by papers, training manuals, and empty coffee cups. They'd been meeting like this for hours each day, working on something nobody outside this room knew about. "Tell me about your first year on the force," Thompson said, making notes in his legal pad. "What made you want to become an officer?" Wilson rubbed his tired eyes. These conversations were harder than any training he'd ever done. "I grew up in a rough neighborhood. Saw a lot of crime, a lot of people hurting each other. There was this one officer, Officer Mike Brown, who used to play basketball with us kids. He made us feel safe, you know?" Thompson nodded, continuing to write. "And when did that change? When did safety start looking like suspicion?" The question hung in the air. Through the window, they could see another news van pulling up outside. I think it was after my partner got shot during a traffic stop. 3 years ago." Wilson's voice grew quiet. "After that, every car became a potential threat. Every person became a possible suspect. Fear," Thompson said, putting down his pen. "It's a powerful thing. It can make us forget what we're really here to do." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Parker entered, looking concerned. "Your Honor, Officer Wilson, there's something you need to see." He turned on the conference room TV. A major news network was running a special report. The headline read, "Exclusive, Officer Wilson's History of Racial Profiling Revealed." Wilson's heart sank as he watched. They were showing dashcam footage from his previous stops, statistics about his arrest record broken down by race, interviews with people he'd pulled over in the past. But Thompson didn't seem surprised. Instead, he turned to Wilson. "What do you see when you watch this?" "I see." Wilson paused, really looking at the footage. "I see myself becoming exactly what I never wanted to be." Thompson reached for the remote and turned off the TV. "Good. Now, are you ready to tell your story?" Wilson looked confused. "My story?" "Yes. Tomorrow, we're holding a press conference. But it won't be what they're expecting." Thompson pulled out a fresh document from his briefcase. "This is what we've been working on. A complete overhaul of police training procedures, focused on community engagement and bias recognition. And you, Officer Wilson, will be its first graduate and eventual instructor." Wilson stared at the document in disbelief. "You want me to teach? After everything I did? Who better?" Thompson asked. "You've lived both sides of this story. You wanted to protect and serve. You lost your way. And now you're finding it again. That's a powerful teaching tool." Lieutenant Parker picked up one of the training manuals they'd been working on. "The Thompson-Wilson protocol has a nice ring to it." Wilson's eyes widened. "You're putting my name on it?" "Change doesn't come from hiding our mistakes," Thompson said. "It comes from acknowledging them and showing others how to do better. The question is, are you brave enough to stand up in front of those cameras tomorrow and tell the truth? Outside, the sun was setting. The news van's lights created long shadows through the conference room windows. In the distance, Wilson could see protesters gathering with signs, both for and against him. He thought about Officer Brown from his childhood, about his partner who got shot, about Judge Thompson's 127 traffic stops. He thought about all the people he'd stopped over the years, whose only crime was looking suspicious to a scared and biased officer. Yes, Wilson said finally. I'm ready to tell the truth. All of it. Thompson smiled. Good. Because tomorrow, we're going to change the narrative. Not just about what happened that night, but about what happens next. The twist wasn't in how the story was being told, but in who was choosing to tell it, and why. The police station's main conference room was packed wall to wall with reporters. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning strikes. Officer Wilson stood behind the podium, his uniform pressed perfectly, his hands gripping the sides of the wooden stand to stop them from shaking. Judge Thompson sat in the front row, his presence providing silent support. Chief Roberts and Lieutenant Parker flanked the podium, their faces serious but hopeful. My name is Officer James Wilson, he began, his voice carrying through the microphones. And I'm here to tell you about the worst mistake of my career and how it became the most important lesson of my life. The room fell silent except for the click of cameras. Wilson took a deep breath and continued. 5 days ago, I stopped a black Mercedes because I thought it looked suspicious. The truth is, I stopped it because the driver was black. I didn't know he was Federal Judge Marcus Thompson. But that shouldn't matter. What I did was wrong, regardless of who was behind the wheel. A reporter tried to interrupt with a question, but Chief Roberts held up his hand, letting Wilson continue. For years I told myself I was doing my job, protecting people. But somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats instead of citizens. Suspects instead of people. Wilson's voice cracked slightly. It took Judge Thompson to show me what I'd become. He looked down at his prepared notes, but decided to speak from his heart instead. Many of you probably expect this to be another story about a racist cop getting fired. Or maybe about a cover-up. But Judge Thompson saw something different. He saw a chance to turn a moment of shame into an opportunity for real change. Thompson nodded encouragingly from his seat. Today, we're announcing the Thompson-Wilson Protocol, Wilson continued, gesturing to the thick binders being distributed to the press. It's a new approach to police training that Judge Thompson and I have developed together. It focuses on recognizing and addressing bias, building community trust, and remembering why most of us became officers in the first place to protect and serve everyone equally. The reporters began flipping through the binders, their expressions changing from skepticism to interest. The protocol includes body camera reviews, community engagement requirements, and regular bias screening. But most importantly, it includes something that's never been done before: real stories from both sides. My story of how bias infected my work, and Judge Thompson's experiences of being profiled over 30 years. Wilson stepped back from the podium, and Judge Thompson walked up to join him. The cameras went wild. Officer Wilson could have lost his job, Thompson said into the microphones. Instead, he's helping create a program that could change how we address bias in law enforcement. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons. A reporter stood up. Judge Thompson, why trust the officer who profiled you to help fix the system? Thompson smiled. Because Officer Wilson did something rare. He admitted his mistake not just privately, but publicly. He's willing to share his story to help other officers recognize and correct their own biases. That takes more courage than most people have. Wilson felt tears forming in his eyes but didn't try to hide them. Judge Thompson taught me that change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from honest conversation, and from being brave enough to admit when we're wrong. The questions came rapid fire after that. How would the protocol be implemented? Would other departments adopt it? What were the measurable goals? But the most powerful moment came when a young black officer from another precinct stood up. "Officer Wilson," he said, his voice emotional, "I've been afraid to speak up about similar issues in my department. Your honesty today, it gives me hope." Wilson stepped out from behind the podium and walked over to the officer, extending his hand. As they shook hands, more officers in the room stood up, both black and white, creating a moment no one had expected. Judge Thompson watched from the podium, seeing his vision taking shape. The press conference had become more than just an announcement, it was becoming a movement. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, shining through the conference room windows. It felt like a sign of things to changing, of new beginnings born from old mistakes. The transformation was no longer just personal, it was becoming institutional. 6 months had passed since the press conference. The small training room at the police academy was filled with 30 officers from departments across the state. At the front of the room, Officer Wilson stood beside a large screen showing traffic stop statistics. "Before we implemented the protocol," Wilson said, pointing to the graphs, "our department averaged 40 complaint-based incidents per month. Last month, we had 3. He clicked to the next slide. But numbers don't tell the whole story. "Barbara, would you like to share your experience?" Officer Barbara Martinez stood up. 3 months ago, she'd been one of the biggest skeptics of the Thompson-Wilson protocol. Now she was one of its strongest supporters. "I thought I was one of the good ones," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "Never used racial slurs, treated everyone professionally. But when we started reviewing my body cam footage as part of the protocol, I saw something different. The way my hand would move toward my weapon more quickly with certain drivers. How my tone changed based on appearance." The room remained silent, many officers nodding in recognition of their own behaviors. "The protocol isn't about shame," Wilson continued. "It's about awareness. Judge Thompson taught me that change starts with honest self-reflection." As if on cue, Judge Thompson walked into the room. The officers stood respectfully, but Thompson waved them back to their seats. He'd been making surprise visits to these training sessions, adding his perspective when needed. "Officer Wilson," Thompson said with a smile, "I believe you have some news to share with the class?" Wilson grinned. "As of this morning, the Thompson-Wilson protocol has been adopted by 50 police departments across 12 states. The Federal Justice Department is reviewing it for potential national implementation." Applause broke out, but Thompson raised his hand. "That's not the most important news. Tell them about last week's community meeting." Wilson's face softened. "Last week, we held our monthly community dialogue session. A young man came up to me afterward. He was the son of someone I'd wrongfully stopped 2 years ago. He told me he'd always wanted to be a police officer, but his father's experience had made him afraid. Now, he's enrolled in the academy." He clicked to a photo on the screen, Wilson standing with a young black man in front of the academy, both smiling. The image spoke volumes about how much had changed. "The protocol isn't just about reducing bad stops," Wilson continued. "It's about rebuilding trust. Every officer in this room has the power to either reinforce fear or build bridges. The choice is yours." Lieutenant Parker, who'd been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. "Show them the community stats, Jim." Wilson clicked to another slide. "Since implementing the protocol, our community tip line calls have increased by 200%. People trust us more, which means we can solve more crimes and help more people." Judge Thompson walked to the front of the room. 6 months ago, Officer Wilson stopped me because of the color of my skin. Today, he's helping change how police departments across the country address bias. That's what real justice looks like." A hand raised in the back. "But what about officer safety? We can't forget that traffic stops can be dangerous." "Good question," Wilson replied. The protocol actually improves officer safety. When you're not approaching every situation with bias and fear, you make clearer decisions. You see people, not threats. And when the community trusts you, they're more likely to warn you about real dangers. As the training session continued, local news cameras filmed quietly from the back. The Thompson-Wilson Protocol had become a national story, but not for the reasons anyone had expected. It wasn't about scandal or punishment, it was about transformation. After class, Wilson found a note on his desk. It was from the young man in the photo. Officer Wilson, today I had my first training session at the academy. I keep thinking about how different things might have been if the officer who stopped my dad had gone through your program. Thank you for showing me that change is possible. Marcus Jr. Wilson pinned the note to his bulletin board, right next to the newspaper article about that fateful traffic stop. The contrast between then and now reminded him daily of how far he'd come, and how far they still had to go. But now, at least, they were moving in the right direction. 1 year to the day after that fateful traffic stop, the National Police Reform Conference's main hall was packed to capacity. Officers, community leaders, and politicians from across the country filled every seat. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. On stage, Officer James Wilson stood beside Judge Marcus Thompson. Behind them, a giant screen displayed the results of the Thompson-Wilson Protocol's first year: complaints down by 85%, community trust up by 70%, solved crimes increased by 40%. A year ago, Wilson began, adjusting the microphone. I was that officer, the one who saw danger in difference, who let fear override fairness. Today, I stand before you as proof that change isn't just possible. It's essential. In the front row, Chief Roberts beamed with pride. His department had become a national model, with police chiefs from across the country visiting to study their transformation. But I'm not here to talk about statistics, Wilson continued. I'm here to talk about Marcus Smith. The screen changed to show a picture of a young black man in a police cadet uniform. Marcus is graduating from our police academy next week. His father was someone I wrongfully stopped 2 years ago. Under the old system, that traffic stop might have pushed Marcus away from law enforcement forever. Instead, he's becoming part of the change. Judge Thompson stepped forward. The Thompson-Wilson Protocol isn't just about preventing bad stops. It's about creating good officers. Officers who see the community they serve as partners, not potential threats. From the audience, Barbara Martinez, now a protocol instructor herself, stood up. Tell them about the neighborhood programs, Jim. Wilson smiled. In the past year, our officers have started coaching youth basketball teams, teaching community safety workshops, and hosting monthly neighborhood cookouts. Simple things, but they make a difference. When people know their local officers as Coach Wilson or Officer Barbara, who makes great tamales, everything changes. The screen shifted to show photos of these community events: officers playing with kids, teaching safety classes, sharing meals with families. The images told a story of transformation that went beyond numbers and policies. A young officer raised his hand. But what happens when we make mistakes? We're still human. Excellent question, Judge Thompson replied. The protocol isn't about perfection. It's about progress. When mistakes happen, and they will, we address them openly, learn from them, and keep moving forward. Wilson nodded. Last month, one of our officers made a questionable stop. Instead of hiding it or defending it, we reviewed it in training. The officer admitted his bias, apologized to the community member, and they both now teach that incident as part of our training program. The screen showed one final set of numbers. 300 departments across 30 states had now adopted the protocol. The federal government had approved funding for nationwide implementation. But our proudest achievement isn't in these numbers, Wilson said, his voice growing emotional. It's in the small moments. Like last week, when a black teenager with a broken taillight didn't feel fear when an officer pulled him over. Or when that officer saw a young man who needed help, not a threat to be contained. Judge Thompson placed a hand on Wilson's shoulder. A year ago, Officer Wilson pulled me over because of the color of my skin. Today, we stand together as partners in progress. That's the power of choosing transformation over punishment, understanding over anger. As they finished speaking, Marcus Smith himself walked onto the stage in his new police uniform. The audience stood applauding as he shook hands with both Wilson and Thompson. The next generation, Thompson said into the microphone, will know a different kind of policing. Not because we forced it upon them, but because we showed them a better way. Wilson looked out at the crowd, officers of all races, ages, and backgrounds, united in their commitment to change. He thought about that night a year ago, how close he'd come to being another statistic, another example of what was wrong with policing. Instead, he'd become part of the solution. Not because he was special, but because someone had seen the possibility of change in him and had the courage to make it happen. As the applause continued, Wilson remembered something Judge Thompson had told him during their first meeting: sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of realization. That traffic stop had been his moment. This conference, this protocol, these changes, they were his legacy. Their legacy. And it was only the beginning.